Think about the last conversation that left you genuinely unsettled, not because someone said something cruel, but because you could not tell, not really, whether the person you were talking to was actually thinking or simply performing the act of thought. They had opinions, confident ones, delivered without hesitation. They had answers before you finished asking, and yet something was missing. Some quality of genuine inner contact with the ideas being spoken, some sign that these words had been arrived at through actual wrestling rather than borrowed wholesale from the nearest available source. You left feeling strangely alone, as though the exchange had happened but no real meeting had taken place. There is a peculiar loneliness in discovering that someone you respected is in fact only a sophisticated repeater, and there is an equal and opposite loneliness in suspecting that you yourself might sometimes be doing the same thing, that what you call your convictions are really just the sediment of your social environment, pressed into shapes that feel like beliefs. These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that matter, and they are the questions Hannah Arendt spent a significant portion of her intellectual life trying to answer. Arendt was a philosopher of the political, of the public, of the conditions under which human freedom and human disaster both become possible. But her thinking circled back, again and again, to what she considered the foundational human capacity, the one that makes everything else either possible or impossible. That capacity was thinking itself, not intelligence, not education, not the ability to argue fluently. Thinking. The specific, active, disciplined, often uncomfortable practice of turning the mind back upon itself and genuinely questioning what it finds there. And Arendt became convinced, through her study of the most catastrophic failures of human civilization, that this capacity was not merely a philosophical nicety. It was a moral necessity. Its absence was not just an intellectual deficiency, its absence was dangerous. The argument she developed turned on a paradox that most people find deeply counterintuitive when they first encounter it. The greatest moral failures in human history, she suggested, were not primarily the work of monsters. They were produced in enormous and catastrophic proportion by ordinary people who had simply stopped thinking, who had outsourced their judgment to systems, to authorities, to the momentum of institutional life. The banality of evil was not a claim that evil was trivial. It was a claim about its mechanism. Evil spreads most efficiently not through the wickedness of the few, but through the thoughtlessness of the many. And by thoughtlessness, she meant something precise, not stupidity, not ignorance, but the specific failure to engage in the kind of internal dialogue that makes genuine moral orientation possible. If this is true, and the evidence of history gives us very strong reasons to take it seriously, then the question of whether a person actually thinks for themselves is not a merely academic question. It is a question about whether someone can be genuinely trusted, not just in the ordinary social sense, but in the deeper sense of trusting that they will notice when something is wrong and will have the inner resources to say so. This is why I want to explore what Arendt's framework actually suggests about how we might recognize genuine thinking in another person and in ourselves. Not through some simple checklist, because genuine thinking resists checklists almost by definition, but through three questions that illuminate the specific qualities Arendt identified as essential to what she called the thinking ego. These questions will not give you a definitive verdict about any individual. What they will do is open a space of genuine inquiry, which is, perhaps not coincidentally, exactly what authentic thinking is supposed to do. If this kind of exploration feels like something you have been hungry for, a way of thinking about thinking that goes deeper than the usual advice about critical thinking or open-mindedness, consider subscribing. I make these videos for people who want to take ideas seriously and who believe that how we think matters as much as what we think. I would be glad to have you here for the longer journey. The first question is this: can you tell me what you believe and what the strongest argument against it is? This question sounds simple. It is not. To answer it genuinely requires a kind of intellectual move that most people almost never make. Arendt called this representative thinking, and she considered it one of the essential features of genuine judgment. Representative thinking is not the same as being able to state the opposing view. Almost anyone can do that at a surface level. It means something more demanding, the capacity to actually inhabit another perspective from the inside, to bring it to life in your own mind with sufficient clarity and fairness that a proponent of that view would recognize their position in your rendering of it. Consider what this actually requires. It requires that you have spent real time with the counter-argument, not just enough time to dismiss it, but enough time to genuinely feel its force. It requires that you have allowed your own position to be genuinely threatened, that you have sat with the discomfort of not knowing whether your view would survive scrutiny. It requires, in Arendt's language, visiting the standpoints of others, moving mentally into positions you do not hold, and testing your own thinking against them. Most of what passes for debate is not this. It is the performance of engagement combined with the reality of total impermeability. People learn to name the opposing view, to recite its claims, to say, "I understand why some people think that, but," and then proceed as though the understanding they have just claimed had no bearing whatsoever on their conclusion. This is the rhetorical form of thinking without the substance. Arendt was particularly alert to this because she saw it as a key mechanism through which ideological thinking operates. Ideological thinking, in her analysis, is thinking that has become closed, that processes new information only by converting it into confirmation of what it already believes. The person who genuinely thinks for themselves will answer the first question differently. They will describe the counter-argument with a specificity and a generosity that suggests real encounter. They will often say things like, "That argument troubles me more than I would like," or "I have never been entirely satisfied with how I respond to that objection." They will show signs of having been genuinely moved by perspectives they did not start with. And they will hold their own conclusion with a certain tentativeness, not the tentativeness of someone who has not thought carefully, but the tentativeness of someone who has thought carefully enough to know how much remains uncertain. There is an important distinction to make here. The person who thinks for themselves is not the person who has no strong views. Arendt herself had extremely strong views. The marker is not the absence of conviction, but the presence of what she called enlarged thinking. A mind that has actually traveled, that has spent real time in other intellectual and experiential territories and brought something back. You can feel this in a person. Their confidence coexists with curiosity. Their positions are held with energy rather than rigidity. The person who has not genuinely thought through their views will show it differently. They will either be unable to articulate the opposing argument in any meaningful way, or they will give a version so flattened and dismissive that it reveals no real engagement. They will often become defensive at the question itself, sensing that this is a challenge to the foundations rather than just the conclusions of their thinking. These are not signs of bad faith necessarily. They may simply be signs that the person has not noticed how much their thinking is shaped by their environment, which is itself a sign that genuine critical self-reflection has not yet reached that depth. I know many of you have been in conversations where you sensed this difference without being able to name it. You talked with someone who seemed knowledgeable, but who felt sealed off, as though the information they possessed had never quite become wisdom because it had never been genuinely worked through. And you may have felt the uncomfortable sense that you sometimes do this yourself, that some of your most confidently held views are more borrowed than examined. This is one of the most difficult things to admit, and it is also, if you are willing to look at it directly, one of the most productive admissions you can make about your own thinking. I know many of you watching this have carried these questions alone for a long time. You have sensed the hollowness in certain conversations without being able to articulate what was missing, and sometimes that loneliness has extended inward toward your own thinking. You have not been sure whether what you believe is really yours or just absorbed. That doubt, uncomfortable as it is actually a sign that you are already doing the thing that matters. The moment you genuinely question whether you are thinking for yourself, you are doing something most people never attempt. So let me ask you directly, when did you last genuinely update a significant belief, not because new information forced you to, but because you went looking for the challenge and found it? Share in the comments below. And if you are not sure, if the question itself is making you uncomfortable in a way you cannot quite name, just type, "I am still working this out." Because that willingness to be publicly in process is itself a mark of genuine thinking, and it helps others here feel they are not alone in their uncertainty. The second question cuts closer to the bone. Has your thinking ever cost you something? Arendt's work is full of examples of people who thought clearly and paid real prices for it. She herself was one of them. Her analysis of the Eichmann trial, her refusal to produce the simple moral narrative that the historical moment seemed to demand, cost her friendships, professional relationships, and a great deal of comfort. She had thought her way to a conclusion that was true but not welcome, and she published it anyway. This was not stubbornness. It was a specific kind of intellectual integrity that has a precise relationship to genuine thinking. The reason genuine thinking sometimes costs something is that genuine thinking is not performed for an audience. It is an internal process that arrives at its own conclusions, regardless of whether those conclusions are socially convenient. Arendt described thinking as a dialogue the self conducts with itself, a two-in-one, the self as both questioner and respondent in an ongoing interior conversation. When this dialogue is genuinely happening, its conclusions are not predetermined by what the person wants to believe, or by what their community expects them to believe. The conclusions emerge from the process itself, and since the social world has strong and frequently unreasonable preferences about what conclusions people should arrive at, genuine thinking will, from time to time, produce results that create friction. This does not mean that all unpopular views are the product of genuine thinking. There is a kind of performative contrarianism that is the mirror image of conformity, thinking that is shaped entirely by opposition to what is socially approved rather than by honest inquiry. The contrarian is not more of an independent thinker than the conformist. They are just organized around a different external reference point. Genuine thinking is organized around internal reference points, around the need to be in agreement with oneself, which is what Arendt considered the ultimate test. Can you live with yourself, given what you believe? So when you ask whether someone's thinking has cost them something, you're asking whether their conclusions have ever been in real tension with their social environment. Have they ever held a view that made them less comfortable in a friendship, a community, a family? Have they ever changed their mind in a direction that was less socially rewarding rather than more, moved from a popular position to a less popular one because honest examination pointed that way? A person who answers no to all of these is giving you information. Either they live in an unusually honest community, or they have not actually been doing the kind of independent thinking they believe themselves to be doing. Because genuine thinking, applied honestly, will occasionally surprise you. It will take you somewhere you did not plan to go. And in a world where social belonging is purchased partly through ideological conformity, that somewhere will sometimes be uncomfortable. The question of cost is ultimately a question about independence. Not independence from other people's ideas, because all thinking begins with ideas that come from somewhere, but independence in the sense of arriving at your own synthesis, your own weighed conclusion, your own judgment, even when that judgment places you in an uncomfortable position relative to the groups you belong to. Arendt believed this was not a natural state, but an achievement, something that had to be actively cultivated and defended. The pressures of social life are strongly in the direction of intellectual compliance, not usually through coercion, but through what she called the they of public opinion, the anonymous and pervasive force of what everyone knows and what nobody seriously questions. To think genuinely is to step back from this force, to occupy a kind of inner distance from the world, not a withdrawal from engagement, but a refusal to let the world simply flow through you unexamined. The third question is perhaps the most revealing, and certainly the most uncomfortable. Can you sit with not knowing? Arendt's thinking was deeply Socratic. She returned to Socrates repeatedly throughout her career, and what she valued most in him was not the famous dialectical method. It was his willingness to not know, his recognition that genuine thinking does not terminate in certainty, his understanding that the examined life is not one that has arrived at all the right answers, but one that is perpetually engaged in the process of examination without the reassurance of a final destination. This is deeply counterintuitive in the contemporary environment, where certainty is treated as a sign of intellectual strength and uncertainty as weakness. The person who says, "I do not know," is often perceived as less authoritative than the person who delivers conclusions with unwavering confidence. And this perception drives enormous amounts of intellectual dishonesty. People perform certainty, they do not feel, because the social rewards for certainty are higher than the social rewards for honest uncertainty. But Arendt, following Socrates, saw this performance as a betrayal of genuine thinking. The kind of questions that thinking actually engages with, questions about meaning, about justice, about how to act rightly in complex situations, are what she called thought things, objects that are transformed by the very act of thinking about them and that resist the closure of final answers. To insist on certainty about these questions is not a sign of intellectual vigor. It is a sign that you have stopped actually thinking about them and replaced thinking with the possession of a conclusion. The person who can sit with not knowing will talk about important questions in a particular way. They will acknowledge complexity without retreating into vagueness. They will say things like, "The more I think about this, the less certain I am about the simple version of the answer, though I am more certain about some of the components." They will be interested in the question itself, not just as a vehicle for expressing their conclusion, but as a genuinely open territory that rewards continued exploration. They will demonstrate curiosity about aspects of the question they have not yet worked through, rather than directing all their energy toward defending the position they have already reached. This is different from the kind of relativism that refuses all conclusions. Arendt was not a relativist. She believed in judgment. She believed that some actions were genuinely evil, and that it was possible to recognize them as such. What she believed was that the path to genuine judgment ran through genuine uncertainty, that you could only arrive at a defensible conclusion if you had honestly inhabited the question before moving toward an answer. The person who cannot sit with not knowing will show it in particular ways. They will treat nuance as evasion. They will push toward resolution before the layers of a question have been adequately examined. And they will often be most confident precisely on the questions that most reward uncertainty, the questions about human nature, about history, about ethics, about the meaning of individual lives. Their certainty on these subjects is frequently a sign that they have not spent enough time in genuine contact with the question to understand why it does not yield easy answers. People who have developed a tolerance for uncertainty tend to have a different relationship to disagreement. They find it interesting rather than threatening. When someone presents a view that conflicts with theirs, their first response is curiosity rather than resistance, because they experience the disagreement as potentially containing information they have not yet accessed. Arendt called this quality enlarged thinking, and she considered it the foundation of political judgment, the ability to think representatively, to make judgments with genuine awareness of the plurality of standpoints that exist. Not seeking consensus or majority approval, but subjecting your own thinking to the imagined scrutiny of perspectives beyond your own. The three questions, taken together, trace an outline of what genuine independent thinking actually looks like when you encounter it. It can articulate what speaks against its own conclusions. It has left marks, costs, frictions in the person's life that testify to its independence. And it maintains a relationship to uncertainty that keeps it alive and open rather than closed and settled. There is a temptation, once you have these markers, to turn them into a test for judging other people, a tool for sorting genuine thinkers from performing ones and positioning yourself firmly in the former category. Arendt would have been deeply suspicious of this use. The examined life is not a credential, it is a practice, and one of the most reliable signs that a person is not actually engaged in genuine thinking is that they have become very comfortable with their own intellectual identity, that they have turned the practice of thinking into a fixed attribute that requires no further maintenance. The person who genuinely thinks for themselves is often the person who is most unsure whether they do, because genuine thinking involves enough honest self-examination to reveal how frequently one fails. The person who is most confident about their intellectual independence often turns out to have simply moved their conformity to a more specialized group. These communities have their own orthodoxies, their own patterns of unexamined agreement, their own versions of the they that replaces genuine judgment with social positioning. So use these questions on yourself first, and use them with genuine rigor. Ask yourself honestly whether you can make the strongest possible case against your most important beliefs. Not the version you have already refuted in your head, but the version that still troubles you. Ask yourself when your thinking last led you somewhere socially costly, and whether you went there or found a way to retreat to a more comfortable conclusion. Ask yourself whether you can genuinely tolerate the uncertainty that attaches to the questions you most care about, or whether you have replaced that uncertainty with a settled position that you defend rather than continue to examine. Arendt's great insight was that thinking is not a property of certain kinds of minds. It is a practice available to any mind willing to engage in it, and her great warning was that the failure to engage in it has consequences that extend far beyond the individual. The person who stops thinking does not just become intellectually stagnant. They become, in a specific and important sense, morally unreliable. Not because they become malicious, but because they become incapable of the kind of independent judgment that would allow them to resist the currents of their environment when those currents move in destructive directions. If what I have been exploring here has genuinely opened something up for you, if it has raised questions you want to keep sitting with, then I want to invite you into an ongoing conversation. There are people here who are working through these same territories, who are trying to think well in a world that makes thinking difficult, who are willing to be uncomfortable with their own assumptions rather than perform a certainty they do not feel. If that sounds like somewhere you belong, subscribe, not to receive answers but to keep working through the questions together. I make these videos as explorations, not conclusions. I genuinely want to hear what you are finding when you turn these questions back on yourself. Leave it in the comments. Tell me which of these 3 questions lands hardest when you apply it honestly to your own mind. I read everything, and the thinking I encounter in the comments frequently takes me somewhere I had not anticipated going. That is, perhaps, the best evidence that genuine thinking is still happening here. You came to this video because the title touched something. Something about whether people around you are genuinely thinking or performing thought, whether you can trust the views of those you rely on. These are real concerns, and they deserve a real framework rather than simple reassurance. Arendt gives us that framework, not as a judgment mechanism but as a mirror. The person most worth asking these 3 questions of, she would have insisted, is always yourself. The one interior dialogue you can actually conduct rather than only observe. This is where genuine thinking begins. And this is where, if you are willing to take it seriously, it can always begin again. No matter how long you have been operating on unexamined assumptions, no matter how deeply the patterns have set. Arendt called this natality, the capacity for new beginnings that genuine thinking always makes possible. The thinking can start again. It can start now. It can start with a question you have never quite allowed yourself to finish asking.